Beneath the glittering streets of Paris lies a world of silence and skulls. The Catacombs, an ossuary holding the remains of over 6 million souls, have long drawn thrill-seekers and the curious. But in the dead of night, some dared to turn this tomb into a ballroom. Masked guests descended into the forbidden tunnels, guided only by candlelight and whispers. Tables were set among femurs and chandeliers hung beside skulls. It wasn't just a dinner, it was defiance. A secret banquet in the belly of death. But who were these people? And how did they pull off such a surreal spectacle without being caught? This is the story of the underground parties that danced with the dead. Beneath the boulevards of Paris lies a silence stitched from millions of voices, a city built of bones that once walked the streets above. The catacombs are today a tourist curiosity, a macabre gallery of neatly stacked skulls and femurs, but their origins were born of desperation. By the late 18th century, Paris was a city drowning in its own dead. Cemeteries overflowed, churchyards bulged, and the stench of rot bled into the streets. Disease spread through neighborhoods where walls of the living pressed up against walls of the dead. The Cemetery of the Innocents, the largest and most notorious, had become a pit where corpses were piled in layers, their fluids seeping into wells, their smell carried on the air. Paris was alive above ground, but suffocating in decay beneath its feet. The crisis demanded intervention. Enlightenment science had begun to see disease not only as divine punishment, but as something carried by miasma, foul air rising from the graves. The authorities, fearing both plague and riot, resolved to relocate the dead. Their solution was as monumental as it was surreal: to empty the cemeteries of centuries and carry their bones into the abandoned quarries that honeycombed the city's southern edge. For decades, Parisian builders had quarried limestone to raise cathedrals, palaces, and bridges. Now the hollowed-out earth would become the final resting place of those whose lives had filled those monuments. The architecture of grandeur was inverted into the architecture of death. Beginning in 1785, a procession unlike any other unfolded through Parisian streets. At night, under the cover of darkness, long carts covered in black cloth creaked slowly from cemeteries to quarries. Priests followed with candles, chanting the office of the dead. The living escorted the dead across the city, an endless migration of bones. Skulls rattled in piles, femurs slid against ribs, the remains of kings and beggars alike heaped together without distinction. The air filled with the toll of bells, and neighbors watched from shuttered windows as centuries of their ancestors were borne past. These nightly funerals lasted for years, until more than 6 million skeletons had been transferred into the underground labyrinth. Once in the quarries, the bones were not tossed in heaps, but arranged with geometric precision. Engineers and inspectors, charged with transforming chaos into order, stacked skulls in rows, framed them with femurs, and built long walls of bone that became both architecture and decoration. Behind these walls lay vast mounds of less orderly remains, but the surfaces visible to visitors were arranged as grim mosaics. Arches of tibias framed walkways. Crosses were formed from skulls embedded among long bones. Inscriptions were carved into plaques, arete. Say ici l'Empire de la Mort. Stop. Here is the Empire of Death. The catacombs became both burial ground and theater, a stage where mortality itself was performed in stone and bone. Above ground, Paris changed. The revolution erupted in 1789, only 4 years after the first bones were transferred. The guillotine stained the city's cobblestones, and cemeteries continued to overflow with new corpses. Yet beneath, in the darkness of the catacombs, the dead were mute witnesses. Revolutionary crowds might shout in the streets, but below their feet lay the silent republic of bones. Aristocrats, clergy, and peasants mingled in perfect equality. The catacombs became a metaphor for the revolution itself, a leveling of distinctions, a democracy of decay. Writers and thinkers saw in the ossuaries the embodiment of their age's contradictions. Reason marching forward above, mortality staring back below. By the turn of the 19th century, the catacombs had already attracted the curious. Public visits were allowed on limited days, lanterns lighting narrow corridors where the living walked past walls of the dead. Philosophers descended to meditate on the brevity of life. Romantics came to weep, to sketch, to find inspiration in the juxtaposition of beauty and horror. Tourists from abroad, hearing rumors of the empire of death beneath Paris, ventured into its darkness, returning with tales that mixed awe with unease. The catacombs became more than a solution to a public health crisis. They became a cultural monument, a mirror held to the city's face. And yet, even in these earliest days, whispers circulated that the catacombs were not always silent. Guards and workers spoke of voices in the tunnels, of shadows that moved without source, of cold hands brushing shoulders. Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of light and imagination in the labyrinthine dark, but stories spread. This information has not been verified. What is certain is that by the 19th century, the catacombs had already become fertile ground for the imagination, a place where death was not only buried but performed. The creation of the ossuaries transformed Paris into a city with two bodies, one of stone, air, and sunlight, and another of shadow, silence, and bone. The two were inseparable. The bridges and palaces above were built from the limestone below. The cemeteries emptied their dead into the hollows left by that stone. Life and death formed layers of a single organism, each dependent on the other. For Parisians, to live in the capital was to walk daily upon the bones of their predecessors, to carry on commerce, love, and politics while 6 million skulls stared upward from the dark. The catacombs, then, were born not from decadence, but necessity. They were not conceived as sites of banquets, revelry, or secret rites, but as a sanitary solution to an urban crisis. Yet their very existence invited reinterpretation. To walk among the bones was to feel mortality press close, to sense that the boundaries of propriety could bend in the shadows. If the revolution had already overturned social order, might not the catacombs overturn the rituals of the living? What began as a burial ground soon became a canvas for imagination. Artists, mystics, philosophers, and libertines found in the empire of death a stage on which to project their longings, their fears, and their desires. The silent city below began to whisper to the restless city above. And so the catacombs stood, a repository of 6 million lives, a labyrinth beneath boulevards, a reminder that every gesture of life was balanced by the certainty of death. Soon, the silence would not remain intact. Candles would be lit among skulls, tables laid upon stone floors, and wine would pour where centuries of blood had dried. The city of bones, born of necessity, would become a theater of transgression. The catacombs did not begin as catacombs. They began as stone, pressed into being by an ancient sea and lifted into the light by human hands that sought to build a city. Long before bones were arranged in patterns of moral geometry, quarrymen tunneled under the left bank for Lutean limestone, a honey-colored rock born of shells and sediments some 45 million years ago. Paris rose upon that harvest. The bridges, the facades, the churches, and when the voids left by extraction threatened to swallow streets and houses, the city learned to brace the underground as carefully as it policed the boulevards above. The Inspection Générale des Carrières, founded in the 1770s under Charles Axel Guillemot, mapped the labyrinth, consolidated ceilings with masonry, planted pillars where the earth sagged like tired lungs, and carved underground plaques naming the streets that ran directly overhead. In those plaques a logic persisted. The subterranean doubled the terrestrial, a second Paris written in chalk. When the crisis of the cemeteries came, this prepared underworld, stabilized, labeled, disciplined, offered a final use. It would be both archive and altar for the city's dead. To stand within the ossuary is to feel not only death, but design. The spectacle that greets the eye, walls of femurs like stacked timbers, courses of skulls staring from their sockets, is not happenstance, but an architecture of persuasion. The vast majority of bones lie in walled masses behind those visible facings, but the frontage is arranged as if a sermon had been taught to become stone. The inspectors who presided over the transfers in the 1780s and after crafted corridors of admonition, low, regular vaults, narrow passages leading to sudden chambers, a rhythm of constriction and release that made footsteps deliberate and breath measured. Here and there, under a barrel vault, a Latin maxim or a French quatrain is set into the wall. Lines from the Psalms, from moralists, from unknown hands that found in the empire of death a perfection of rhetoric. The most famous injunction stands at the threshold to the ossuary proper, a rite. C'est ici l'empire de la mort, where a lintel compresses the living as if to fit them, briefly, into proportion with the bones ahead. The bones themselves are the building blocks of a paradox. Skulls form rosettes, crosses, pilasters that suggest the classical orders stripped of ornament, reduced to the basic grammar of support and span. Femurs, dense, straight, suited by nature to bear weight, are laid as stretchers, their ends aligned to make planes, their shafts forming horizontal strata like geological beds. Between these formal surfaces lie the chaos of ribs, vertebrae, and fragments, a rubble behind the facade that stands for the crowded centuries the ossuary contains. The whole becomes both architecture and admonition, a monument that insists form can rise from ruin, that mortality can be composed if not defeated. Moisture beads along the vaults in a perpetual dew. The air holds at a near-constant coolness. Reports fix it near 14 degrees Celsius, though the figure varies with depth and season, and the smell is not quite rot, and not quite stone, but some third scent made where thyme and calcium meet. It is difficult to exaggerate the care with which the underground was taught to hold steady the city above. In certain stretches, quarry ceilings have been arched with carefully laid limestone voussoirs. Elsewhere, stout pillars of dressed stone rise like short, thick trees. Where the original quarrymen left perilous emptiness, engineers built Hagues et Borrages, dry stone retaining walls stuffed with smaller stones to brace the cut. Inscriptions, chiseled into chalky faces, record the date of consolidation and the initials of the men responsible. On broad, squared cartouches you can still read the ghost names of streets: Rue Diome, Rue de la Tomissoire, Boulevard Saint-Jacques, marking the world above like a memory carried in bone. The underground Paris has its own urbanism. Intersections called carrefours, cul-de-sacs, galleries named for saints or surveyors, even the remains of subterranean wells and air shafts that bring a thin, steady breath to the corridors. Geology becomes biography in such a place. The Luteon Bank is layered with zones the quarrymen knew by feel and sound, benches of good building stone alternating with marlier, less reliable bands, each carrying the fossil trace of the sea that set them. In some ceilings you can see the imprints of shells and echinoids, a pale archive of lives so ancient they answer the human skulls below with a wider patience. The strata tilt imperceptibly, and the tunnels follow them like readers who keep their finger on a line. The city above, with its grids and diagonals, is imitated below in a less precise script written by the necessities of stone, but the kinship is clear. Here as there, routes are chosen, obstacles turned into structure, emptiness leveraged into passage. Not all of the underground is ossuary. The official catacombs, open to visitors by appointment in the 19th century and today managed as a museum, are a curated fraction of an underworld that extends for hundreds of kilometers beneath the southern arrondissements. Off the public path, galleries run dark for long stretches. Some collapse, some narrow into crawl spaces where the chalk stains the knees. In out-of-the-way chambers the quarrymen left marks of their own existence. Tally marks, dates, the rough-etched profiles of fortresses and ships. One celebrated relief, attributed to a quarryman named Decure, carves in low, patient strokes the bastions of a Mediterranean stronghold remembered from military service, an entire remembered world pressed into the quarry wall, as if to prove that memory itself could be built in stone. Other sculptures and niches are reported in antiquarian accounts, though access is restricted and attributions vary. This information has not been verified. Yet, even rumor serves architecture here, extending the felt outline of the underground into chambers the mind makes for itself. Water is the other architect. Seepage darkens walls into maps, and in some lower levels pools gather, turning chambers into unwilled cisterns and reflecting the vaults in a trembling mirror. In the 18th and 19th centuries, certain underground springs were enlisted to wash bones or to steady humidity where wood shoring made it necessary. The particulars differ by source, and by the time one follows the references down, they dissolve in anecdote. This information has not been verified. What endures are the facts the body trusts: a damp that clings to cloth, a chill that equalizes rank, a faint ticking drip that writes time where clocks are absent. Sound travels strangely in those corridors, moving ahead of the walker and returning behind with the steadiness of a heartbeat. A single candle magnifies space, throwing long ribs of shadow along the bonework like the inside of a great beast. The route through the ossuary is choreographed to teach the living how to walk. Low lintels enforce a bow. Sudden alcoves stage the eyes for comparison and reflection. The alternation of narrow and broad demands attention. At various points, the inspectors installed tablets that do more than moralize. They contextualize. Names of vanished cemeteries, Saints Innocents, Saint Etienne de Grèce, Madeleine, are set into the walls like the headings of chapters, reminding the visitor that this gallery is an anthology of parishes and centuries. Dates repeat like a refrain: 1786, 1814, 1842. Each year a campaign of transfers undertaken in the nocturnal procession of carts from the churchyards. Sometimes a cross is formed from skulls, sometimes a heart. Sometimes a long, straight band of orbitae gazes outward without symbol, daring the visitor to write meaning if he can. Beneath the formality runs the compromise that made it possible. The ossuary is a facade of order raised in front of an honest chaos. Behind the bone walls lie massifs of remains poured in without pattern, older and younger mingling, identities wholly dissolved. The geometry is therefore not arrogant, but modest. It acknowledges that the visible order is limited and outward-facing, a discipline applied for the living who must pass through and keep their courage. It is a lesson about cities as well. Boulevards hold facades smooth with stone, while behind them, the rooms of the poor and the ambitions of the rich pile together in less photogenic heaps. The catacombs merely render this truth legible and permanent. The inspection's masonry also reveals the perpetual bargain between ambition and safety. Throughout the 19th century, as Paris expanded and the modern city took shape under Haussmann, the engineers below labored to make the ground trustworthy. Where new boulevards pressed their weight into uncertain ground, arcs were thickened, pillars multiplied, and voids backfilled. Underground plaques testify to these interventions, the way a city keeps marginalia on itself when the stakes are high. The famous Barrière d'Enfer, today's Place d'Enfer, took its name in part from customs gates, and in part from the popular synonymy of the gate to the catacombs entrance with the gates of hell, an irony the city tolerated because the underworld had already been claimed in moral architecture. To say that the ossuary is beautiful is to risk a misunderstanding, yet beauty is one of its instruments. The arrangement of skulls in alternation with long bones, the symmetry of niches, the solemn simplicity of inscriptions, these formal choices deliver a kind of clarity to an otherwise overwhelming fact. They do not console, they prevent panic. Order allows contemplation. In their way, the inspectors were liturgists, shaping a procession route through the doctrine of mortality. The rhetoric is not subtle, but it does not need to be. The message persists even when the lanterns are dim and the chalk dust grits underfoot. You will join us, and the sooner you accept that the more cleanly you may live. And yet the architecture of death is not strictly moralizing. It is also hospitable to what the city later did with it. The measured height of the vaults, the broad plains of stacked femurs, the steady temperature, the reliable dryness of many galleries. These practical and aesthetic properties made the ossuary perversely suitable for gatherings that inverted its original intent. Any space that arranges the senses this carefully invites ceremony, and not all ceremonies are pious. If Paris above was increasingly regulated by police and propriety, Paris below offered a stage where other scripts could be performed. The very success of the ossuary as architecture created the conditions for its appropriation. Tables could be set where walls did not crumble. Music could carry along purposeful corridors. A candle's flame could find its duty amplified by bone. The living would test this hospitality in the years to come, bringing wine and argument to a hall that had been designed for silence. Thus, the architecture of death did not merely receive 6 million remains. It shaped the meanings that could attach to them. It made the underground legible and navigable, aesthetic and moral, durable and strange. It found a form adequate to a fact the city could not otherwise face. In the chapters that followed above ground, republics and empires, uprisings and restorations, this form held, a constant beneath change, and into it the curious, the defiant, and the hungry would descend. They would eat among skulls and debate the brevity of life. They would improvise rites the city refused to sanction. They would discover that a well-made corridor can lead to transgression as easily as to prayer. The bones would keep their silence, and the masonry would keep its counsel, while candles guttered and shadows made theaters along the chalk. The architecture of the catacombs, however deliberate and austere, would have been empty stone without its cargo. The transformation of quarries into ossuary required an immense act of logistics. The transfer of millions of bodies from Paris's overstuffed cemeteries into a darkness that promised both order and oblivion. This process began in 1786, 2 years before the storming of the Bastille, and unfolded like a ritual that was at once civic, spiritual, and bureaucratic. Paris at that time faced a crisis of the dead. For centuries, the Cemetery of the Innocents had received the remains of Parisians by the thousands each year, a mound of mortality in the city's heart near Les Halles. Accounts describe graves so shallow that bones surfaced with rains, and the stench of decomposition was said to infiltrate homes and markets. In 1780, a wall collapsed under the pressure of decaying flesh, flooding an adjacent basement with the refuse of centuries. Physicians warned of miasmas, invisible vapors of rot believed to spread contagion, and the public grew fearful of the living proximity of so many dead. Enlightenment thinkers, quick to tie health to civic order, urged reform. The monarchy, ever cautious of scandal in an era already restless, took action. The cemeteries would be cleared. The chosen solution was not cremation, still alien to Christian custom, but translation, an ancient idea reimagined. The bones would be relocated to the quarries on the city's outskirts, specifically those of the Thomissoir sector beneath what is now the 14th arrondissement. These galleries, stabilized under the supervision of the inspection de carrières, offered vast space where death could be hidden yet honored. In April 1786, the Council of State issued a decree. The ossuary was to be consecrated and made ready. A priest of the parish of Saint-Jacques blessed the site, sprinkling holy water in a small ceremony witnessed only by officials. Thus began one of the greatest urban migrations in history, a procession of bones. The transfers occurred under the cover of night, a deliberate choice to dampen scandal and shield citizens from the sight of carts bearing what had once been neighbors, ancestors, lovers, enemies. At dusk, workmen opened pits in the cemeteries, exhuming bones with shovels and carrying them to waiting wagons. Each cart, draped in black cloth, was escorted by a priest murmuring the offices for the dead. Torches flamed in the dark, casting a spectral procession through the streets. From the Cemetery of the Innocents, across the city, the wagons moved toward the southern gates and descended into the quarries at the Barrière d'Enfer, literally, the gate of hell. It was a theater of logistics doubled as a theater of morality. Paris saw itself rehearsing the end of days, with the dead summoned from shallow graves to await a final resting place. Inside the quarries, the bones were initially heaped without order into pits and trenches. Over time, however, the inspectors sought to impose dignity. Skulls and femurs were arranged in decorative walls, while inscriptions recorded the origin of each deposit. Blocks of stone set into the gallery mouths named the cemeteries: Saint Nicolas de Champs, Saint Laurent, Saint Méthode, the Carmelite grounds. Each name was a chapter title in the Book of Paris's mortality. Transfers continued into the early 19th century, reaching their greatest intensity during the Napoleonic era. Cemeteries closed, churchyards emptied, new remains joined old. By the end of the campaigns, an estimated 6 million Parisians had been reinterred. The symbolism of the transfer was not lost on contemporaries. Some saw in it a triumph of reason. No longer would putrefaction threaten the air of Paris. Science and engineering had disciplined death. Others perceived sacrilege. The individuality of graves was dissolved into anonymity, the prayers of families replaced by bureaucratic inscriptions. For the Church, uneasy in its waning authority, the catacombs became a compromise, at once consecrated ground and a reminder of its reduced role in civic life. The revolution soon confirmed the sense of upheaval. The monarchy that had ordered the ossuary fell, but the catacombs endured, a subterranean monarchy of skulls immune to guillotine and decree. The nightly processions left traces in memory. Residents living near the routes reported hearing the slow rumble of wheels at odd hours, accompanied by chanting. Windows glowed faintly as families watched the black carts pass. The repetition of this ritual for years ensured that entire generations grew accustomed to the idea that death itself was being reorganized. Some even claimed that the transfers created a new relationship between Parisians and mortality, one that emphasized the collective over the individual. To walk above Les Halles was no longer to sense the innocents rotting below. Now, the dead were dispersed in corridors where no single identity prevailed. The city had exhaled, unburdened of its ancient corpse. The arrangement of the ossuary evolved over decades. In the early years, bones lay in heaps, disordered and overwhelming. Visitors reported the confusion of walking past tumbling piles of skulls, a chaos more monstrous than consoling. Around 1810, Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury, inspector of quarries, imposed the aesthetic order we recognize today. He directed that bones be stacked in walls, skulls set in patterns, corridors marked with tablets bearing moral verses. Under his supervision, the ossuary became not only storage but spectacle, a place where the lessons of death could be read like scripture. It was Héricard who opened the catacombs to visitors, transforming a sanitary necessity into a philosophical promenade. The transfer of the dead was therefore not merely a logistical achievement, but a cultural pivot. It signaled the city's willingness to subordinate tradition to rationality, to exchange the familiar intimacy of churchyards for the anonymity of an engineered necropolis. It also embodied the paradox of Enlightenment Paris. Science disciplined the corpse, yet spectacle accompanied the act. Citizens could not resist imagining the nocturnal processions as ghostly pageants, the city itself as a stage where the dead rehearsed eternity. And indeed, in the darkness of the quarries, among the echoing steps of workers stacking femurs, one might well believe that Paris had found a way to build itself upon its own vanished flesh. This mass relocation did more than solve a problem. It created a monument whose meaning would change with time. What began as a sanitary measure would, in the 19th century, become a site of romantic fascination, a stage for writers, artists, and the defiant revelers who brought candles and wine into the empire of the dead. The transfer of the dead had set the conditions for these future intrusions, providing not only walls of bones, but also the mythic atmosphere in which the living might seek forbidden communion. By the early decades of the 19th century, the ossuary beneath Paris had grown into something larger than an engineering project or a sanitary measure. It had become a metaphor carved into stone and bone, a subterranean proclamation that mortality governed all. To descend into the catacombs was to enter not a simple tomb, but an empire, l'Empire de la Mort, as one of the earliest inscriptions declared. The choice of the word empire was deliberate, a reminder that death held dominion more absolute than any monarch or republic above. The ossuary was not a cemetery in the traditional sense, because it offered no individuality, no grave markers, no flowers. Instead, it erased distinctions. 6 million Parisians, from beggars to nobles, priests to prostitutes, lay together in anonymous arrangement. Death was democracy perfected, hierarchy dissolved into stacks of skulls and femurs, the differences of life leveled by the architecture of oblivion. The inspector of quarries, Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury, recognized the potential of this transformation and set about shaping it. Appointed in 1810, he ordered the ossuary to be arranged with the precision of an architect and the theatrical sensibility of a dramatist. Where once bones had been heaped chaotically, he commanded order, skulls aligned in neat rows, femurs stacked like bricks, corridors walled with repeating patterns of mortality. He installed plaques inscribed with moral phrases and verses drawn from scripture and philosophy. Arrête, c'est ici l'Empire de la Mort. How great is death, and yet how calm its empire. Visitors could not pass without confronting aphorisms that reminded them of the frailty of life and the permanence of death. Héricourt's reimagining turned the catacombs into both shrine and spectacle. He opened them to limited tours, guiding curious Parisians and foreigners alike through torchlit passages. Writers, artists, and aristocrats descended, their imaginations quickened by the contrast between the glittering salons above and the silent ossuary below. The catacombs were unlike the pyramids of Egypt or the tombs of Rome. They were not the monuments of kings, but the collective monument of a city's populace. One could walk through galleries lined with bones and know that every skull belonged to someone who once had spoken, laughed, loved, and suffered in the same streets now bustling with carriages overhead. For the romantics of the 19th century, this empire of death became irresistible. Victor Hugo would later describe the catacombs as a terrific abode, a place where the imagination was sharpened by the silence of 6 million souls. The young Charles Nodier, an author and bibliophile, led friends through the tunnels with lanterns, using the catacombs as a stage for macabre meditations. Painters sketched shadows of skulls by candlelight, capturing the eerie symmetry of bone walls. Some claimed to hear whispers carried through the stone corridors, or to feel an icy breath when lantern flames flickered. Though such tales may have been exaggerated, this information has not been verified. They circulated widely, ensuring that the catacombs' reputation grew beyond their physical boundaries. The ossuary also provided fertile ground for moral instruction. Guides emphasized that here the mighty and the humble were indistinguishable. School teachers brought students to witness the lesson of mortality firsthand. Pilgrims seeking religious reflection found in the catacombs a new kind of memento mori, a reminder that all ambitions ended in the same silence. For a city remade by revolution and empire, where thrones rose and fell with dizzying speed, the catacombs offered a counterpoint of permanence. Regimes might collapse, but the empire of death remained unchallenged. Yet the appeal was not only solemn. The very excess of bones, their arrangement into patterns and monuments, lent an aesthetic fascination. Héricourt constructed rotundas and porticos, galleries where walls of skulls curved like architectural ornament. He placed altars and urns, creating spaces where visitors might pause as if in chapels of mortality. The catacombs became, paradoxically, beautiful, a terrifying beauty, a sublime reminder that death could be both grotesque and orderly. As the 19th century advanced, the catacombs seeped into the imagination of Europe. Foreign travelers returned home with stories of Paris's empire of death, tales that mingled horror with fascination. The ossuary featured in guidebooks, engravings, and poems. It was said that the catacombs expressed something uniquely Parisian, a city capable of transforming even decay into art, of reshaping necessity into spectacle. In the Romantic mind, the catacombs were not a place of despair, but of confrontation, where one faced the abyss and emerged with new awareness of life's fleeting pleasures. Still, darker undercurrents persisted. Some visitors brought wine and candles, transforming tours into clandestine revelries. Rumors spread of students daring each other to spend nights in the ossuary, of lovers stealing moments in shadowed alcoves. Authorities were not blind to such stories, but the labyrinth of galleries made surveillance impossible. The empire of death, though ordered on the surface, hid recesses where secrecy flourished. Already, seeds were being planted for the future legends of underground banquets and forbidden gatherings, where revelers claimed to dine among the bones. The empire of death was thus both a monument and an invitation. It invited meditation, but also transgression. It reminded the living of equality in death, but it also offered the living a space to test boundaries. As the 19th century progressed, Paris itself became a city of contrasts. Boulevards widened, gaslights illuminated, revolutions flared and faded. Above ground, progress marched. Below, the empire of death waited patiently, offering its silence to those who dared descend. It was inevitable that some would not resist the temptation. The catacombs were not only a burial ground, they were a stage. And soon, on that stage, the living would enact dramas as audacious as the ossuary itself. Banquets, concerts, and clandestine rites that turned the empire of death into an empire of the imagination. The 19th century was an age of contrasts in Paris. On the surface, the city glowed with the sheen of industrial progress, sweeping boulevards, glittering cafes, and salons where wit and fashion paraded nightly. Yet beneath this radiant facade stretched a darkness more compelling to the romantic imagination. The catacombs, that empire of death hidden under the stones of modernity. To the romantic mind, so attuned to melancholy, mystery, and the sublime, the ossuary was more than a burial ground. It was a theater where mortality spoke in silence and where the imagination could stretch beyond the confines of daily life. Writers and poets found the catacombs irresistible. For Victor Hugo, whose Les Miserables later employed subterranean Paris as both metaphor and setting, the catacombs revealed the city's second, shadowed body, a vast circulatory system carrying not life, but memory and decay. In his descriptions, the earth itself seemed to pulse with secrets, tunnels twisting like veins of forgotten time. Charles Nodier, a central figure in Romantic literature, led torchlit excursions below, transforming the descent into a ritual of awe. His companions, a circle of artists and thinkers, followed him down narrow passages that opened into galleries where the dead lay assembled not as individuals, but as architecture. For Nodier, the catacombs were not grotesque, but sublime, an encounter with the infinite that art alone could translate. Artists, too, were drawn to the play of shadow and light that bones created. Sketches from this period show not only the ossuary walls, but also the flicker of lanterns casting halos upon skulls, suggesting that death itself glowed with a strange, spectral beauty. Painters captured the contrast between rigid geometries of stacked femurs and the soft curves of candle smoke curling into darkness. For them, the catacombs became a studio of mortality, where every skull was both object and subject, every corridor a composition in chiaroscuro. The romantic fascination was not confined to France. Travelers from across Europe came to see this marvel. In an age when the grand tour still carried weight, young aristocrats and intellectuals sought the catacombs as a counterbalance to the grandeur of Versailles or the elegance of Parisian opera. Where those above-ground spectacles celebrated life and culture, the ossuary offered confrontation with its opposite. English poets wrote of it as a reminder of the futility of ambition, while German romantics perceived in it a Wagnerian drama of existence, a symphony composed not of notes, but of silence and stone. Part of the allure lay in the philosophical lesson the catacombs whispered. Here were bones of revolutionaries and monarchists, priests and atheists, courtesans and soldiers, side by side, indistinguishable. To romantics, obsessed with the fragility of individual experience, this was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it erased the uniqueness of the self, liberating because it dissolved the boundaries of class, faith, and power. In the empire of death, one's identity was not defined by worldly labels, but by the common destiny of dust. Some visitors interpreted this universality with reverence, others with playfulness. Parties of students from the École des Beaux-Arts carried violins into the tunnels, their music echoing through the galleries until it seemed the bones themselves sang. Accounts, though some have not been verified, spoke of improvised poetry recitals beneath arches of skulls, verses that merged love and mortality in the romantic manner. There were whispered tales of secret rendezvous, of lovers stealing kisses under the gaze of 6 million silent witnesses. For every somber meditation, there was also a hint of rebellion, a determination to turn death into backdrop rather than end. The catacombs entered Romantic literature as a symbol of Paris itself, a city where beauty and horror intertwined, where boulevards of light hid corridors of shadow. In novels and poems, the catacombs stood as both metaphor and reality, the underworld beneath civilization, the reminder that life was fragile and fleeting, the stage where mortality played its final act. By mid-century, this fascination had grown to near obsession. Journalists reported on the fashion of catacomb visits, describing torchlit processions of gentlemen and ladies who, dressed in silks and gloves, picked their way through damp stone floors to marvel at walls of skulls. Some mocked it as morbid tourism, while others insisted it was an education in philosophy. To the Romantics, it was both. a performance of melancholy that confirmed their belief in art's power to transmute horror into beauty. The romantic attraction to the catacombs cannot be separated from the turmoil above ground. France was racked by revolutions, restorations, and empires rising and falling in dizzy succession. The catacombs, with their permanence and silence, offered contrast. Where politics screamed, the ossuary whispered. Where cities burned with change, bones endured unchanged. To descend was to step outside history, to stand in a timeless empire that mocked human ambition. Yet this very permanence made the catacombs alluring to those who feared their own insignificance. Writers, artists, and lovers all inscribed themselves in memory by aligning their lives, however briefly, with the bones of 6 million predecessors. The catacombs became a mirror in which the Romantics saw both their despair and their hope. The despair of anonymity, the hope of belonging to something vast and eternal. This tension between reverence and revelry would only deepen. As Romantic fascination gave way to decadence in the later century, the catacombs would no longer be just a place for meditation. They would become the stage for audacity, clandestine banquets, concerts, and secret societies that transformed the ossuary into a theater of the forbidden. What began as romantic contemplation was soon to become romantic transgression. By the middle of the 19th century, the catacombs had already transformed from a sanitary necessity into a cultural phenomenon. Yet fascination alone was never enough for a city like Paris. The Romantics had meditated on the empire of death with quills and sketches, but a younger, more restless generation longed for something different. They did not want merely to contemplate the bones. They wanted to claim them as part of their own living theater. Thus began the age of transgression, when the catacombs shifted from solemn ossuary to secret playground, their silence pierced by laughter, music, and revelry hidden from official eyes. The appeal of the forbidden was central to this transformation. Above ground, Paris bustled with progress, the arcades, cafes, and glittering boulevards of Haussmann's renovations. But beneath it stretched a world without order, without law, and without watchful eyes. The catacombs were both near and inaccessible. Only a handful of sanctioned tours passed through the official ossuary, while hundreds of miles of tunnels remained uncharted, unsupervised, and irresistible. Those who dared to slip beyond the guarded passages discovered a labyrinth where one could vanish from society's gaze. To enter was to step into a parallel city, one where rules dissolved and imagination dictated its own order. The thrill began with students, law students, medical apprentices, and above all, the irreverent scholars of the École des Beaux-Arts. For them, the catacombs offered the ultimate escape from lectures and examinations. Descending with candles and bottles of wine, they transformed chambers of silence into makeshift taverns. Their shadows danced on bone walls as voices sang chansons of rebellion. Though some of these accounts rest in anecdote rather than record, this information has not been verified. It is clear that a subculture of youthful defiance had taken root below Paris. Artists and poets followed. Where earlier Romantics had drawn in notebooks, their successors staged performances. They read verses aloud to audiences of fellow initiates, the words echoing until it seemed the skulls themselves murmured assent. Some staged tableaux vivants, arranging bodies among ossuary walls to mimic classical scenes of death and resurrection. The setting, drenched in symbolism, heightened the drama. The catacombs were not merely a backdrop, but a collaborator, their silence giving weight to every whispered line. But secrecy gave these gatherings their true allure. To attend a concert or banquet in the catacombs was to step into a ritual of defiance, to cross a threshold from the sanctioned world above into a forbidden kingdom below. Attendees whispered passwords, followed guides through twisting passages, and passed under arches marked by skeletal guardians. To arrive was to feel both triumph and dread. They had broken a boundary that most Parisians only imagined. The very danger. The risk of collapse, of getting lost, of arrest by quarry inspectors, was part of the attraction. Authorities attempted to curtail this underground culture. The Inspectorate of Quarries issued decrees against trespassing, sealed entrances, and station guards. Yet the catacombs resisted containment. Tunnels crisscrossed beneath streets and buildings, and new entrances appeared as quickly as old ones were blocked. Cataphiles, as they came to be known, developed secret maps, marking paths that avoided patrols. Some claimed entire chambers as their own, carving graffiti into stone to announce their hidden dominion. The allure was not only youthful rebellion, but also a search for authenticity. To Parisians weary of artifice, the catacombs offered an encounter with the raw, the unmediated, the elemental. Here was a place where masks dropped, where the spectacle of salons could not intrude. Surrounded by the anonymous dead, revelers felt paradoxically alive. The contrast between fragile candlelight and eternal bones heightened awareness of the moment. To drink, sing, or dine in such a space was to assert life against the empire of death, to carve a fleeting celebration into the immovable silence. Not all gatherings were frivolous. Some adopted the air of secret societies. Freemasons and other esoteric orders were rumored to descend for rituals of initiation, the catacombs lending an aura of mystery to their oaths. Others whispered of occultists seeking communion with the spirits of the 6 million souls housed in stone. In these stories, half legend, half possibility, the catacombs were not simply a stage for revelry but a temple for hidden rites. Again, much of this remains unverified, but the very uncertainty added to the mystique. The paradox of the catacombs deepened. The more they symbolized silence, equality, and mortality, the more they invited the living to transgress, to rebel, and to transform death into theater. Paris itself was a city of boundaries blurred, the sacred and profane, beauty and decay, law and rebellion. The catacombs mirrored this duality. They reminded visitors that life's meaning often emerged most clearly when set against the certainty of death. By the late 19th century, the catacombs had become both myth and reality, a space where official tours offered moral lessons while unofficial banquets offered forbidden joy. The allure of the forbidden was now part of their identity. Once created to rid the city of bones, the catacombs had become something far larger, a crucible where Paris tested its boundaries, a hidden stage where its restless spirit could play without constraint. It was only a matter of time before these clandestine explorations coalesced into organized events, lavish banquets, orchestral concerts, even theaters staged beneath the streets. And in those performances, the catacombs would reveal not only their darkness, but also their strange, paradoxical vitality. By the late 19th century, the catacombs of Paris had already transcended their utilitarian origins, metamorphosing into a subterranean mirror of the city above, chaotic, alive, and hungry for spectacle. If the ossuary had once been a site of romantic meditation and clandestine exploration, it now became the unlikely host to a new kind of transgression, lavish banquets staged among the bones of 6 million Parisians. These feasts, remembered in whispers and occasional newspaper scandals, became the apotheosis of Parisian decadence, the collision of death and revelry, silence and song, austerity and abundance. The very act of dining in the catacombs was an inversion of the ordinary. Above ground, Paris teemed with grand restaurants, glittering cafes, and salons where the elite paraded their wealth. To abandon those gilded spaces for dripping limestone vaults was a deliberate gesture, a rejection of polite society and a celebration of the forbidden. To descend with tables, candelabras, wines, and musicians was to transform the ossuary into a theater of the absurd, where every gesture carried the weight of parody and defiance. Accounts vary, and some have not been verified, but patterns emerge. The banquets often began with processions. Guests, often students of the École des Beaux-Arts, writers, or bohemians, followed torchbearers through narrow tunnels until they arrived at larger chambers, already prepared as dining halls. Bones served as walls. Skulls became silent spectators. Wooden planks or stone ledges were transformed into makeshift tables, draped in cloth stolen from above. Candelabras cast warm halos upon damp ceilings, their flames reflecting off polished craniums until the entire chamber seemed lit by a morbid constellation. Food was central to the ritual, but it was not merely about sustenance. Dishes were chosen for symbolism. Roasted fowl to mock the hunger of the grave, fruits to suggest fertility among sterility, cheeses whose decay mirrored the surroundings. Most important was the wine. Barrels of red Bordeaux or Burgundy rolled down into the earth, poured generously into cups that clinked against bone walls. With every toast, revelers drank both to life and to death, collapsing the boundary between the two. The banquets were also theatrical. Music was played on violins or guitars, their notes vibrating through narrow corridors, creating echoes that transformed a single instrument into an entire orchestra. Songs ranged from bawdy tavern tunes to solemn hymns, their juxtaposition heightening the sense of carnival. Poems were recited, plays performed, and at times mock sermons delivered with skulls for pulpits, parodying religion even as the space itself retained its aura of the sacred. The catacombs became a stage upon which Paris enacted both its irreverence and its yearning for transcendence. The presence of bones lent every gesture a double meaning. A kiss stolen between lovers seemed bolder when witnessed by 1,000 skulls. Laughter sounded sharper against the silence of 6 million dead. Even the act of eating was transformed. Every bite became a declaration of vitality in the empire of decay. The revelers were not mocking the dead, but rather asserting kinship with them, claiming that life's pleasures burned brightest when set against mortality's shadow. Not all who attended were bohemians. Rumors spoke of aristocrats descending incognito, their silks hidden beneath plain cloaks, eager to taste the forbidden alongside students and poets. For them, the catacomb banquets offered freedom from etiquette, an opportunity to mingle across class lines in a space where all distinctions dissolved. In the ossuary, nobles and commoners alike became shadows illuminated by the same candlelight, their laughter echoing together against stone. The authorities condemned such gatherings, deeming them irreverent, dangerous, and unsanitary. Quarry inspectors patrolled entrances and occasionally caught revelers in the act, dispersing them with stern warnings or arrests. Yet the banquets persisted, their secrecy part of their appeal. Invitations were whispered, locations shifted, and entrances concealed. The very act of reaching the banquet was part of the ritual. Those who found their way proved themselves worthy of the forbidden feast. For all their decadence, the banquets were also a form of philosophy. They embodied the Parisian belief that joy and sorrow, beauty and horror, life and death could never be separated. By dining among bones, the participants confronted mortality not with fear, but with laughter, not with denial, but with embrace. The catacombs became not only a grave, but also a reminder that life is fragile, fleeting, and therefore to be celebrated with intensity. In time, stories of these banquets spread beyond Paris. Travelers carried tales of torchlit feasts among bones to London, Vienna, and beyond. Some exaggerated them into orgies of depravity. Others romanticized them as sacred rituals. Whatever the version, the image of Parisians dining among the dead captured the imagination of Europe. The catacombs were no longer simply a local curiosity. They had become a symbol of Paris itself, a city unafraid to dance with death, to turn decay into spectacle, to transform even bones into beauty. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the underground banquets would evolve further, drawing not only students and poets, but also anarchists, revolutionaries, and dreamers who saw in the catacombs the perfect stage for defiance. What had begun as bohemian rebellion would become, in time, a broader metaphor for Parisian identity, a city forever negotiating between darkness and light, mortality and vitality, silence and song. By the turn of the 20th century, the banquets of the catacombs had established themselves as Parisian legend, half truth, half embellishment. But feasting alone was not enough for a city whose soul pulsed with music. Paris above ground resounded with operas, cabarets, and symphonies, but beneath the boulevards, in the damp and stony silence of the ossuary, music acquired a different, almost otherworldly power. The catacombs, with their miles of resonant corridors and vaulted chambers, became a hidden amphitheater where sound did not merely entertain, but seemed to awaken the dead themselves. The acoustics of the catacombs were unlike any concert hall in Europe. Every note, struck or sung, multiplied into a chorus as it bounced along limestone walls and echoed through unseen passageways. A lone violin could fill an entire chamber with harmonics. Its voice carried farther than the instrument ever intended. A guitar strummed softly would seem to shimmer, notes overlapping like ripples in water. Even human voices transformed. Whispers became chants, and songs turned into chants of eternity. To play music underground was to commune with the architecture of death, to let bones and stone become collaborators in sound. It began with small performances, much like the banquets themselves. Students brought instruments into the tunnels as diversions. But soon, musicians realized that the catacombs could be more than a backdrop. It could be the very medium of performance. Accounts speak of quartets hidden beneath the earth, their melodies reaching listeners seated among skulls arranged in neat walls. Audiences sat in silence, aware that their presence was a privilege, an initiation into something forbidden and profound. These concerts were never advertised. They were whispered about, their memory preserved in anecdotes, private journals, and scattered mentions in newspapers. Though some details have not been verified, what set these underground concerts apart was their intimacy with mortality. Above ground, an opera could overwhelm with grandeur, but underground, music took on fragility. A song sung by candlelight, surrounded by bones, carried an immediacy impossible to replicate elsewhere. Every note seemed to declare, life is brief, and beauty is fleeting, yet here it is, alive for a moment. The audience was not only listening to music, but participating in a ritual of remembrance and defiance. Some performances leaned into the macabre. Musicians arranged skulls atop makeshift stands as if they were listening patrons. Others composed pieces specifically for the setting, slow, mournful adagios that merged with dripping water and distant echoes until it was impossible to distinguish human intention from the soundscape of the catacombs themselves. More daring groups staged satirical parodies of grand operas, mocking the pomp of Parisian elites by performing in the most humble and forbidden of spaces. Not all the music was solemn or satirical. There were moments of wild abandon, when musicians struck up tavern songs and audiences joined in chorus, their laughter and stomping reverberating until it seemed the whole earth shook with joy. In those moments, life triumphed fiercely over silence, the empire of bones briefly conquered by rhythm and voice. Occultists, too, found purpose in catacomb music. Some esoteric circles believed that vibration could awaken spirits or communicate with the dead. Rituals incorporated chanting, drumming, or the ringing of bells, with participants claiming to feel presences stirred by the resonance. Whether true or imagined, the catacombs lent themselves to such interpretations. To sit among 6 million bones while low notes reverberated through the stone was to feel surrounded by more than mere emptiness. Authorities, once again, sought to suppress these gatherings. The Inspectorate of Quarries sealed entrances, patrolled tunnels, and punished trespassers. Yet music is difficult to silence. The more forbidden the performances became, the greater their allure. For many Parisians, to hear music underground was to participate in the city's most intimate secret, to step outside of time itself. By the early 20th century, the catacombs had acquired a reputation not just as ossuary, but as stage. Writers compared their echoes to Gothic cathedrals. Musicians marveled at their natural acoustics. They were no longer merely a curiosity. They were a subterranean concert hall, albeit one hidden from the public and tinged with danger. The banquets had transformed food into defiance. Music transformed silence into art. Both together made the catacombs into more than a repository of bones. They became a living underworld, where Paris tested its limits of expression. The catacombs concerts, whispered about in salons and journals, symbolized the city's refusal to let death remain mute. In time, the underground banquets and concerts would merge into spectacles that defied imagination. Feasts accompanied by orchestras, plays staged before walls of femurs, masquerades where masks of bone reflected candlelight. The catacombs had become a theater in every sense, a stage for decadence, rebellion, art, and philosophy. If the banquets brought indulgence and the concerts gave voice to silence, then the masquerades transformed the catacombs into a carnival of the uncanny. To don a mask underground was to blur not only the boundary between identities, but also between the living and the dead. Paris, long enthralled by theater, costume, and disguise, found in the ossuary, a stage where ordinary rules dissolved and every gesture became a defiance of mortality itself. Accounts, some factual, others veiled in myth, described torchlit processions of masked revelers winding through the tunnels. Faces were hidden beneath papier-mâché skulls, painted visages of saints and demons, or grotesque caricatures of aristocrats and clergy. Robes dripped with false blood, feathered headdresses mimicked birds of ill omen, and some dared to stitch real bones into their costumes, rattling with each step. The transformation was total. No longer were these Parisians mere students or nobles, but characters in a theater of shadows where the catacombs themselves served as set and chorus. The masquerades were not only performances of horror, they were deeply satirical. Much as Parisian carnival traditions had long mocked authority, so too did the catacomb masquerades parody the institutions of church and state. Mock bishops, draped in tattered vestments, gave false benedictions to skeletons. Kings and queens of bone were crowned upon makeshift thrones of femurs. Soldiers danced with grinning skulls as partners. Through parody, revelers not only entertained themselves but also challenged the world above, suggesting that beneath the earth, all hierarchies dissolved into dust. Music was essential, of course. Drums pounded against the walls, their reverberations turning rhythm into heartbeat. Fiddlers played feverish jigs, their notes racing through the tunnels like sparks. At times, silence would suddenly descend, broken only by the drip of water or the shuffle of masked feet. These moments of stillness, punctuated by sudden bursts of laughter, heightened the sense that participants were not simply at a party but part of a ritual of inversion, a dance with the dead. The masquerades also carried an erotic undertone. Masks allowed anonymity. Anonymity allowed freedom. Lovers kissed in corners, identities concealed. Hands intertwined in darkness, bodies pressed together in secret alcoves. The presence of bones magnified the urgency of such encounters. Desire, like music and laughter, became sharper when shadowed by mortality. To love underground was to seize life with desperation, knowing that death watched silently from the walls. Yet danger was ever present. Police patrols increased, and the inspectorate of quarries warned that the tunnels risked collapse under such revelries. Some masquerades were broken up abruptly, masks confiscated, revelers fined or arrested. These interruptions only amplified the allure. To attend was to gamble not only with one's freedom, but with one's reputation. Artists and aristocrats alike risked scandal, but for many, that risk was precisely the appeal. The catacombs offered liberation that no ballroom above ground could provide. Literary figures, too, found inspiration. Poets wrote verses of skeletons waltzing with queens, of laughter echoing through eternity. Illustrators sketched grotesque, yet elegant figures draped in bone and velvet. The masquerade became a metaphor for Paris itself, a city that wore many faces, forever hiding one truth behind another, forever dancing on the edge of decay and beauty. But there was more than satire and sensuality. For some participants, these masquerades bordered on the mystical. Wearing the visage of death, they believed, was a way to reconcile with it. To dance in a skeleton mask, to laugh through hollow eyes, was to confront the inevitable with courage. In this interpretation, the masquerades were less about mocking death than about mastering it, about transforming fear into performance. Above ground, society may have whispered disapproval, but underground, in the flicker of candles and the rattle of bones, the masquerades carried on. They embodied the paradox that defined the catacombs: reverence and irreverence, mortality and vitality, solemnity and laughter, all entwined in one breathless spectacle. As the 20th century unfolded, these secret masquerades would become more elusive, their records blurred into rumor, their details swallowed by silence. Yet the image remained indelible. A procession of masked figures moving through tunnels of bone, torches blazing, laughter echoing. A carnival of the dead in the city of light. Every revelry beneath Paris's surface carved a deeper wound in the pride of those sworn to protect the city's order. The catacombs, with their millions of skeletons arranged in solemn patterns, were meant to be monuments of respect, symbols of civic discipline imposed upon chaos. Yet by the 19th and early 20th centuries, those same tunnels had become arenas for decadence, art, and defiance. What began as whispered banquets and musical experiments had escalated into full-blown masquerades, and the authorities could not ignore such subversion forever. The clash between revelers and guardians of propriety became inevitable. The Inspectorate of Quarries, created originally to stabilize the undermined ground beneath Paris, had long warned of dangers: collapse, flooding, suffocation, and disease. But their concern was not only geological. Each underground banquet and masquerade undermined the legitimacy of municipal control. If citizens could turn the catacombs into theaters of rebellion, then Paris above was threatened by contagion, not of plague, but of disorder. The authorities, both police and bureaucrats, recognized that the catacombs were more than an engineering risk. They were a political problem. Crackdowns became routine. Patrols of gendarmes descended into the tunnels at night, lanterns casting sharp beams across skull-lined walls. Reports describe arrests made in chambers where wine glasses still lingered and candlelight still flickered. Some revelers escaped through hidden exits, disappearing into the labyrinth, while others were hauled above ground to face fines, social shame, and, in certain cases, brief imprisonment. The authorities justified these raids with appeals to public health and safety, but their actions also revealed an anxiety about what the catacombs had come to represent: a domain beyond their reach, a shadow Paris immune to official control. The banquets and concerts were not simply diversions. They had become symbols of freedom, of life lived on one's own terms. Each crackdown only deepened the catacombs' reputation as a place where true Paris thrived, raw and ungoverned. Students mocked the authorities in taverns, boasting of evading capture. Aristocrats who had once laughed at the rituals now whispered about them with envy, their curiosity sharpened by prohibition. To ban was to advertise, to restrict was to romanticize. Authorities understood this paradox, but they pressed on. Maps of the catacombs were confiscated, entrances sealed with iron gates, and penalties stiffened for trespass. By the early 20th century, efforts became militarized. Entire squads patrolled known entry points, and inspectors walked the tunnels with authority badges pinned proudly to their uniforms. Yet the labyrinth was vast, with over 300 kilometers of passages. To control every corridor was impossible. Revelers adapted, moving deeper, disguising gatherings as geological surveys, even bribing quarry workers to provide entry. The catacombs, by their very design, resisted mastery. The church, too, spoke out. Priests warned from pulpits that masquerades mocked the sanctity of the dead, that concerts and ossuaries desecrated holy memory. Religious papers published lurid accounts of debauchery beneath the city, fanning moral panic. To some Parisians, these reports painted the catacomb revelers as heretics, reveling in blasphemy. Yet to others, the outrage only confirmed the allure. What greater thrill than to dine, dance, and laugh in the very place society forbade? The conflict crystallized into a pattern: secrecy, discovery, crackdown, retreat, and return. Each time, the catacomb culture survived. Each attempt at control merely added another layer to the legend. In this sense, the authorities were both adversaries and unwitting co-authors of the catacomb myth. Without their raids, without their condemnations, the stories of banquets and masquerades might have faded into obscurity. Instead, they became folklore, proof of a Paris that could never be fully governed. What troubled the authorities most was not the drinking or the music, but the philosophy that underpinned these gatherings. The catacomb revelers declared, by their very presence, that death was not to be feared, that the city's bones were not mere relics, but participants in life. To laugh among skulls was to reject the state's narrative of order and solemnity. To wear masks of bishops and kings was to mock the hierarchies above ground. In short, these gatherings represented a challenge to the very structures of power. As the 20th century advanced, the crackdown reached a climax. After the Second World War, with Paris rebuilding itself, the government sought to control every shadow of the city. Entrances to the catacombs were sealed in earnest, locked and welded. Patrols were intensified, and official tours were established to reframe the ossuary as a site of education rather than rebellion. Yet even this officialization revealed an uneasy truth. The authorities had not destroyed the culture of underground banquets. They had merely co-opted it, sanitizing what had once been wild into something digestible for tourists. But beneath the surface, far from the guided paths, the culture endured. Authorities struck, yes, but Paris itself struck back in whispers, in laughter, in music that still drifted through forbidden corridors. The war between order and rebellion had not ended. It had simply gone deeper underground, where gendarmes' lanterns could not always reach. The masquerades gave the catacombs their most theatrical chapter, but the crackdown ensured they would never fade from memory. For in trying to silence the revelry, the authorities transformed it into legend. And legends, unlike banquets, cannot be extinguished with iron gates or patrols. They live on, echoing like footsteps in the tunnels of the dead. If the authorities tried to police the catacombs with lanterns and iron gates, the artists of Paris entered with notebooks, canvases, and insatiable curiosity. For them, the ossuary was not merely a forbidden playground, but a vast, subterranean metaphor. In the corridors where bones were stacked with geometric precision, they found not only death, but also beauty, symmetry, and story. Writers, painters, musicians, and philosophers all felt the gravitational pull of the city beneath the city, and all emerged with works that helped shape the myth of Paris itself. The Romantics were among the first to see in the catacombs a landscape worthy of verse. Victor Hugo, though more famously associated with the sewers in Les Miserables, hinted at the catacombs in his musings on Paris as a body, alive above and skeletal below. To him, the tunnels represented the unconscious of the city, a repository of memory and decay. Charles Nodier, a writer of Gothic tales, described bones illuminated by candlelight as though they were lines of unwritten poetry waiting for readers to give them voice. The catacombs thus became not just a site of death, but a canvas upon which the living could inscribe their fears and fascinations. Painters followed. The stark contrasts of skull and shadow, the play of torchlight against calcified walls, provided motifs irresistible to artists attuned to Romantic and Gothic aesthetics. Eugene Delacroix is rumored to have sketched impressions after a descent, though such drawings are lost or remain hidden in private collections. Others, less celebrated, left watercolors of macabre banquets where skeletal backdrops framed dancers in costume. Even when the images strayed into exaggeration, they captured the essential paradox that the catacombs could host both horror and vitality at once. By the later 19th century, symbolist poets and decadent writers claimed the catacombs as their own. To them, the tunnels embodied all the obsessions of their age: mortality, eroticism, and the collision of sacred and profane. Joris Karl Huysmans, chronicler of decadence, wrote of the catacombs as a palace of absence, where silence is architecture and bones are the ornaments of eternity. Whether or not he attended one of the secret banquets, his prose suggests he breathed their atmosphere. The catacombs seeped into art not as documentary, but as atmosphere, as metaphor, as inspiration for those who sought to pierce the veil between worlds. Musicians, too, found resonance. In salons above ground, composers whispered about the acoustics of subterranean concerts. Some even sought to recreate the effect, composing chamber pieces meant to evoke the echo of strings in stone corridors. A few daring performers descended to play in secret gatherings, their melodies weaving through ossuary walls. Whether these performances were heard by dozens or merely a handful, their legend grew, as though the catacombs themselves were accomplices to music forbidden above. The surrealists of the 20th century embraced the catacombs as a ready-made dreamscape. André Breton, father of surrealism, declared Paris to be the capital of the imagination precisely because it harbored such realms of contradiction. For artists bent on dismantling bourgeois order, the catacombs were a gift, a physical space where death mocked propriety, where time collapsed, and where meaning itself disintegrated into dust. Surrealist photography captured skulls arranged like theater curtains, tunnels photographed as infinite vanishing points, human lovers draped in shadows that resembled skeletons. Yet it was not only famous names who descended. Amateur sketchers, students of the École des Beaux-Arts, and anonymous poets left traces, scribbling graffiti onto walls, verses, signatures, declarations of love. Some remain today, faint but legible, evidence of the urge to mark presence amid absence. To inscribe a name on a wall of bones was to assert life in the very belly of death, a gesture both defiant and intimate. The catacombs thus became a muse not through official commissions, but through transgression. To write of them was to risk moral outrage. To paint them was to embrace the grotesque. To descend into them was to break the law. And yet, it was precisely this fusion of danger and inspiration that drew artists. For them, the catacombs were not ruins to be mourned, but instruments to be played, metaphors to be unfolded, and symbols to be wielded against the complacency of polite society. The authorities may have struck back with patrols and gates, but the artists struck deeper. With every poem, every canvas, every photograph, they immortalized the catacombs in cultural memory. The banquets might be scattered, the masquerades interrupted, but on paper and in paint they could live eternally. And as Paris matured into the 20th century, the catacombs became more than stone and bone. They became myth, not just underground, but in literature, art, and the imagination of the world. Paris is a city forever shaped by war, and the catacombs, though built to house the dead, inevitably became enmeshed in the struggles of the living. Whenever the city trembled under threat, its people turned not only to barricades and boulevards, but also to the labyrinth beneath their feet. Wars and revolutions redefined the catacombs, transforming them from mausoleum into refuge, fortress, arsenal, and even battleground. The legacy of these subterranean wars adds yet another layer to the labyrinth's legend. During the French Revolution, Paris convulsed with fury and bloodshed. Streets ran red, churches burned, and guillotines sliced in rhythm with the cries of liberty. The catacombs, already consecrated as the city's ossuary, absorbed the overflow of terror. Some whisper that the bodies of revolutionaries and aristocrats alike found their way into the silent tunnels, their bones mingling with those of the long dead. What has not been verified but often repeated is that secret meetings occurred in the ossuaries, where revolutionaries plotted by torchlight, speaking beneath ceilings heavy with the weight of centuries. In such retellings, the catacombs become more than a burial ground. They become the cradle of revolution itself, where silence shielded conspiracies that could topple thrones. In the 19th century, amid political upheavals from Napoleon's fall to the Commune of 1871, the catacombs again served as refuge. Insurgents sought out the labyrinth to escape the authorities, slipping through hidden entrances to evade capture. Some accounts suggest that communards, fleeing Versailles troops, vanished into the tunnels, never to re-emerge. Others tell of caches of weapons hidden among the bones, guns resting on skulls as though the dead themselves stood guard over rebellion. Authorities feared this subterranean warfare, for to fight underground was to confront an enemy on terrain no map could fully command. But it was in the 20th century, during the World Wars, that the catacombs became militarized in earnest. In the First World War, though trench lines lay far from Paris, the fear of bombardment drove some Parisians to use the tunnels as air raid shelters. Families huddled among the bones, listening as the distant thunder of war reverberated through the earth above. For them, the catacombs provided a grim sanctuary, safety entwined with mortality, comfort wrested from an ossuary's silence. The Second World War deepened the catacombs' military role. During the Nazi occupation of Paris, the labyrinth became a theater of resistance. The German army, aware of the catacombs' scale, feared them. They sealed many entrances and stationed guards near others, but the resistance knew the tunnels better. They mapped routes, established clandestine headquarters, and used the darkness to their advantage. One of the most famous underground stories is that of Colonel Roltingui, who coordinated elements of the French forces of the interior from within the catacombs during the 1944 liberation of Paris. In those days, bones were not merely relics. They became silent allies, witnesses to whispered strategies that helped reclaim the city. The Germans themselves occasionally used parts of the tunnels as storage and command posts, but their unfamiliarity with the labyrinth made them cautious. Resistance fighters, more agile and knowledgeable, could vanish into passages where Nazis dared not follow. Thus, the catacombs became a contested zone, a shadow battlefield in the larger war for France. Beneath the city of lights, battles of maps and footsteps unfolded in silence, as vital to the liberation as gunfire on the boulevards. The wars left scars in the catacombs still visible today. Graffiti etched by soldiers, resistance fighters, and civilians alike remain on the walls. Names, dates, and symbols scratched into stone. These are echoes of a subterranean front line, reminders that the catacombs, though built for the dead, sheltered the dreams and terrors of the living. Visitors who stumble upon such inscriptions feel the continuity of history pressing in. The bones of medieval Parisians lying beside the signatures of 20th-century fighters, both united by the stone womb of the city. What emerges from this martial history is a paradox. The catacombs were designed to bring order to death, to contain chaos by stacking bones neatly in rows. Yet war transformed them into theaters of chaos once again, filled with the voices, plans, and fears of those fighting for survival. They were tomb and refuge, graveyard and stronghold, silence and defiance. War blurred these categories until the catacombs became a mirror of Paris itself, fragile yet enduring, wounded yet alive. The legends of revolutionary meetings, insurgent hideouts, and resistance headquarters reveal a pattern. When the city is at war, life always seeks shelter beneath death. And the catacombs, ever patient, absorb each conflict, layering memory upon memory, inscription upon inscription, until their walls become a palimpsest of the city's most desperate hours. Thus, when one walks the tunnels today, the silence is deceiving. It is not an empty silence, but a silence swollen with wars fought, secrets shared, and victories won. It is the silence of bones that have heard cannons and whispers alike, of corridors that have shielded both the defeated and the triumphant. In war, the catacombs became more than a cemetery. They became the lungs of Paris, breathing defiance in its darkest hours. When the cannons fell silent and Paris rebuilt itself after wars and occupations, the catacombs did not recede into irrelevance. Instead, they took on a new identity, no longer a refuge of necessity, but a sanctuary of curiosity, rebellion, and self-expression. From the mid-20th century onward, a new breed of explorer descended into the labyrinth, not to hide from soldiers or police, but to confront the mystery of the underground itself. They called themselves cataphiles, lovers of the catacombs, and through them the ossuary gained yet another chapter in its long, peculiar history. The rise of the cataphiles was born from a paradox. By the mid-1900s, the municipal authorities had sealed most official entrances to the catacombs, hoping to prevent accidents, illegal parties, or criminal use of the tunnels. Yet prohibition only increased the allure. The forbidden, after all, has always lured those hungry for adventure. Students, artists, wanderers, and misfits discovered forgotten access points, a broken sewer grate, a disused metro shaft, a hole in a cellar wall. They slipped inside and entered a world unlike anything above ground, a world where rules dissolved and imagination reigned. At first, the cataphiles were solitary explorers, armed with candles or flashlights, creeping through corridors of bones to sketch, photograph, or simply experience the silence. But soon, networks formed. Maps circulated hand to hand, each bearing warnings and notes from previous travelers. This tunnel floods. Here lies a chamber with carved thrones. Do not descend. Collapse risk. By the 1970s, cataphilia had evolved into a thriving subculture. Groups organized nighttime expeditions, celebrated birthdays, staged concerts, and painted murals on damp stone walls. Where once priests held rituals and soldiers plotted resistance, young Parisians now claimed the underground as a theater of counterculture. The cataphiles embraced an ethos of discovery. To wander the tunnels was to defy the monotony of life above: office work, neon lights, commuter trains. Down below, hours lost their meaning. The constant temperature, the absence of natural light, and the eerie repetition of skulls created a sensation that time itself had dissolved. In that timeless realm, friendships deepened quickly, trust was tested, and adventures carried the aura of pilgrimage. The cataphiles did not merely trespass. They felt they communed with the city's bones. Art thrived in the catacombs under their stewardship. Graffiti bloomed across stone walls, not crude scrawls, but elaborate works. Murals of skeletons drinking wine, surrealist landscapes stretching across ossuary chambers, political slogans written in dripping paint. Musicians lugged guitars and violins through narrow passages, staging clandestine concerts where notes reverberated as though the bones themselves hummed along. Photographers with long exposures captured haunting tableaus, a candle illuminating a row of skulls, a masked reveler framed by shadows, a lone figure reading beneath arches of femurs. Every descent was both an act of resistance against authority and an artistic performance in itself. Of course, cataphilia was not without risk. Police raids occasionally swept through the tunnels, leading to arrests and fines. Collapses, sudden floods, and disorientation posed constant threats. Some cataphiles became legendary for their daring. One group mapped entire kilometers of unmapped passages, while another constructed makeshift cinemas deep underground, complete with projectors and stolen electricity cables. Stories circulated of lovers who spent entire weekends below, of philosophers who gave impromptu lectures surrounded by bones, of chefs who carried down full meals to serve at midnight banquets. Each tale blurred truth and myth, yet all contributed to the mystique. By the late 20th century, the cataphile culture had crystallized into a community. Though secretive, it was bound together by unwritten codes. Never vandalize bones. Always respect the tunnels. Leave markers for those who follow, and protect the labyrinth from outsiders who might exploit it. This ethic mirrored earlier custodians of the catacombs, priests, revolutionaries, resistance fighters, who had also used the tunnels as sacred space. In this way, cataphiles saw themselves not as trespassers, but as inheritors of a tradition stretching back centuries. The authorities, however, saw it differently. For them, cataphiles were nuisances, lawbreakers, and potential liabilities. In 1980, the Prefecture de Police established the cataflex, a special police unit tasked with patrolling the catacombs. These underground officers carried flashlights and maps, chasing out intruders and sealing entrances. Yet the cataphiles adapted. For every sealed grate, another entrance was discovered. For every patrol, there was a diversion. The game of cat and mouse only reinforced the subculture's identity. To be a cataphile was to outwit authority, to trespass into history, and to emerge with stories whispered only among the initiated. By the dawn of the 21st century, cataphiles had become woven into the broader mythology of Paris. Tourists above ground spoke of them in hushed fascination, imagining masked wanderers dining by candlelight in the presence of bones. Media accounts sensationalized their exploits, depicting them as outlaws, urban shamans, or anarchic artists. Some cataphiles embraced the notoriety, others resented it, preferring the silence of unobserved exploration. But whether celebrated or condemned, the subculture endured, carrying forward the catacombs' role as a stage for human imagination. In the cataphiles, the catacombs found yet another incarnation. From sacred space to ossuary, from battlefield to gallery, the labyrinth had always absorbed the needs of the living. Now, in the hands of these modern adventurers, it became both a playground and cathedral, rebellion and communion. Through them, the bones of Paris were no longer silent. They pulsed with life, art, and the defiance of those who dared to descend. To speak of the catacombs is to speak of death, but to speak of the banquets within them is to speak of life, life definitely asserted in the very presence of bones. If the 18th century banquets of eccentric nobles were remembered only in whispers, their echoes were revived in the 20th and 21st centuries by the cataphiles. For them, the act of feasting underground was more than a party. It was a deliberate inversion of fear, a ritual of rebellion, and an art form that tied them to the long tradition of human gatherings beneath Paris. It began with improvisation. Early cataphiles would descend with nothing more than bottles of cheap wine, loaves of bread, and wedges of cheese, arranging impromptu picnics on damp stone floors. The irony was irresistible. To eat and drink in a charnel house was to mock mortality, to say to the skulls, "You may surround us, but you do not yet claim us." But as the subculture grew bolder, so too did the banquets. By the 1970s, cataphiles were hauling tables, candles, and full meals through the labyrinth. They discovered chambers that lent themselves to grandeur, vaulted halls, wide intersections where the ceiling rose high enough to create the illusion of a banquet hall. In those places, they staged feasts worthy of legend. Accounts describe rooms lit by hundreds of candles, their flickering light animating skulls until they seemed to grin at the revelry. Red wine glistened in glass bottles, passed from hand to hand. Bread and charcuterie were spread across improvised tables. Musicians played, their instruments echoing strangely in the narrow chambers, while voices lifted in song and laughter. It was said that the acoustics transformed even simple notes into something otherworldly, as if the bones themselves sang back. Every underground feast became a performance, half celebration, half séance. The themes of these banquets varied. Some were anarchic raves, with pulsing music and flashing lights powered by illicitly spliced cables. Others were intimate dinners, where a handful of friends shared conversation over fine wines and multi-course meals, their laughter mingling with the solemn silence of the ossuary. A few took on ceremonial qualities, hosts dressed in robes, toasts offered to the dead, or symbolic foods served to honor history. In these gatherings, food became sacrament, wine became libation, and the catacombs themselves became a temple where life and death met in communion. The most infamous stories speak of elaborate underground restaurants. In the 1980s and 1990s, rumors spread of chefs descending with portable stoves, preparing roasted meats and stews in chambers once dug for quarries. Some tales verge on myth, claiming that banquets included dozens of guests, multi-course feasts, and even fine china carried through narrow passages. Whether all these accounts are true remains uncertain. This information has not been verified, but the very fact that people believe them speaks to the enduring allure of the underground banquet. In 2004, Parisian police stumbled upon something extraordinary while conducting a routine patrol of the catacombs. They discovered a fully equipped underground cinema, complete with projection equipment, a bar, and even a dining area. The space, hidden deep in the labyrinth, had been wired for electricity and decorated with care. It was a modern echo of the ancient banquet, proof that the tradition of underground feasting and revelry was alive and evolving. Though the police dismantled the cinema, its discovery only added to the mythos, cementing the catacombs' reputation as the ultimate stage for subversive gatherings. For the cataphiles, these banquets were not acts of desecration, but acts of homage. To them, the dead were not mocked but honored by the vitality of the living. To feast among bones was to acknowledge mortality while refusing to be subdued by it. It was an embrace of transience, a reminder that joy, laughter, and art were the best answers to the inevitability of death. Just as ancient Aztecs wore flayed skins to symbolize renewal, the Parisians of the underground wore their mortality openly, celebrating life in the very heart of death's dominion. Not everyone agreed, of course. Authorities condemned these feasts as disrespectful, illegal, and dangerous. Critics decried the blending of revelry with human remains. Yet history offers countless precedents for such rituals. From Roman banquets held in tombs to medieval feasts in ossuaries, humans have long sought to bind the presence of the dead with the vibrancy of the living. The Paris catacombs are only the latest canvas upon which this primal instinct has been painted. Today, whispers of these secret banquets continue. Social media occasionally reveals photographs of candlelit tables, masked diners, or painted chambers adorned with food and wine. Most cataphiles guard their secrets closely, sharing details only within trusted circles. Yet the legend grows regardless, spreading like the flicker of a candle in the dark. For those who dare to descend, the idea of breaking bread beneath the city remains irresistible, a chance to be part of a tradition that is at once ancient and defiantly modern. In the banquets of the cataphiles, we glimpse the deepest paradox of the catacombs. They are a city of the dead, yet they pulse with the creativity of the living. They are a reminder of mortality, yet they inspire acts of rebellion, art, and joy. And in those clandestine meals, where laughter mingles with silence and wine stains the shadows, Paris reveals its truest self. A city where death is never far away, but where life insists on celebrating anyway. The catacombs of Paris, once little more than a pragmatic solution to overflowing cemeteries, have become one of the most enduring symbols of humanity's fascination with death. In the modern age, their meaning has expanded beyond bones and tunnels. They are a canvas for art, a stage for rebellion, a metaphor for hidden truths, and a global icon of the strange beauty that arises when the living and the dead share space. The modern imagination has absorbed the catacombs, reshaping them into stories, myths, and spectacles that resonate far beyond the city itself. Literature was among the first mediums to adopt the catacombs as a setting for exploration. Writers of the 19th century romanticized the labyrinth as a Gothic underworld, a place where the line between history and nightmare blurred. Victor Hugo, in Les Miserables, described the sewers of Paris as a sinister labyrinth. And though he wrote specifically of sewage tunnels, readers quickly merged his imagery with the catacombs. By the 20th century, horror and mystery authors seized upon the ossuary as a perfect backdrop, a stage where the claustrophobia of tunnels and the silence of bones intensified fear. From pulp novels to philosophical essays, the catacombs became shorthand for the unconscious of the city, a realm where secrets festered and truths revealed themselves in whispers. Cinema amplified this vision. French filmmakers used the catacombs as a backdrop for thrillers and dramas, but it was international cinema that elevated them into the realm of myth. In the 2014 film As Above, So Below, the catacombs became the stage for a descent into hell, where characters confronted both their physical limits and their spiritual fears. The film may have sensationalized the tunnels, but it captured something essential: the sense that beneath Paris lies another world, both terrifying and alluring, reflecting the anxieties and desires of the living. Even outside horror, documentaries and travel films returned again and again to the catacombs, depicting them as a strange wonder, part museum, part tomb, part carnival. Popular culture, too, embraced the imagery. Video games recreated the tunnels as playable labyrinths, where players navigated shadows while skeletons glared from the walls. Music videos staged concerts and performances among the bones, aligning modern rhythm with ancient silence. Fashion designers borrowed the motifs of skulls and arches, weaving the catacombs into aesthetic statements that blurred macabre with elegance. Even tourism itself became a form of imagination, with millions queuing each year to walk the ossuary's official paths, each visitor constructing their own private story about what the bones meant. Yet perhaps the most profound influence of the catacombs on modern imagination lies in the way they mirror psychological landscapes. For philosophers and psychoanalysts, the catacombs symbolize the unconscious, the dark, buried strata of human existence. To descend into the tunnels is to confront the hidden, the repressed, the fears and desires we prefer not to face. Just as Paris itself rests upon its own graveyard, so too does each individual carry beneath their conscious life a labyrinth of memories, traumas, and unspoken truths. The catacombs have become, in this sense, a metaphor for the human condition itself, beautiful, terrifying, full of bones, and yet endlessly alive with meaning. The persistence of underground banquets within this imaginative framework further underscores the paradox. To eat, drink, and celebrate among bones is to engage in symbolic theater. It is not merely rebellion against authority, nor only homage to the dead, but also a creative rewriting of fear. The catacombs invite people to transform dread into laughter, silence into song, and death into art. And each retelling, whether in novels, films, or whispered cataphile legends, strengthens the mythology, making the catacombs less a place and more an idea. The idea that beneath civilization lies another truth, one that must be faced, feared, and perhaps even celebrated. Even institutions have acknowledged this allure. The Musée Carnavalet in Paris has exhibited photographs and artifacts from the catacombs, framing them as cultural heritage. The city permits a small portion of the ossuary to be open to tourists, carefully curated to balance fascination with respect. Yet these official efforts only highlight the tension. What is permitted is never enough to satisfy the hunger for the forbidden. The imagination craves the hidden chambers, the uncharted tunnels, the secret banquets that continue despite police raids. For every tourist who buys a ticket, there is another wanderer searching for an unmarked entrance, eager to script their own story in the city of bones. In the digital era, the catacombs live not only beneath Paris but also online. Photographs circulate across social media, blending fact with performance. Masked figures standing among skulls, candlelit tables staged for effect, explorers posing in chambers no map admits. Some images are authentic, others staged, but all contribute to a collective mythos that expands daily. The catacombs have become a collaborative work of art, co-created by generations of priests, rebels, cataphiles, artists, and digital dreamers. The catacombs in the modern imagination are thus not merely historical relics, but living symbols. They are reminders of mortality, invitations to rebellion, canvases for creativity, and mirrors for the subconscious. They remind us that beneath every city lies another, beneath every life lies death, and that the bones of the past will always find a way to speak in the present. And perhaps this is the greatest banquet of all, not one of bread and wine, but one of imagination, where every skull becomes a guest and every tunnel a story waiting to be told. To walk through the catacombs is to walk through a paradox. Here, the dead outnumber the living, yet life insists on pressing itself into every crack of stone. For centuries, Paris struggled with the practical burden of its own mortality, and the solution carved into the earth became far more than storage. It became a stage for myth, a temple of memory, and a mirror for the restless heart of humanity. The bones that line those tunnels speak not only of death, but of survival, resilience, and reinvention. The banquets, both historical and modern, embody this paradox most vividly. To dine among skulls is to acknowledge death while simultaneously defying it. Each toast raised underground becomes a declaration that life, fleeting though it is, must be lived with intensity. For the aristocrats of the 18th century, such feasts were playful inversions of social order. For the cataphiles of the 20th and 21st centuries, they were rebellions against authority, boredom, and the sterile order of the surface. In every era, the act of gathering in the ossuary transformed dread into laughter, silence into song, and bones into audience. The catacombs are not unique in this impulse. Across cultures and centuries, humans have returned to the presence of the dead to mark their own vitality. Romans ate meals in their tombs. Medieval Europeans prayed in charnel houses. Aztec priests wore the skins of the sacrificed as a sign of rebirth. To live alongside death is not morbid, it is deeply human. The Paris catacombs, filled with their 6 million mute witnesses, are only the latest canvas for this ancient drama of fear, reverence, and defiance. What endures is not only the shock of the bones, but the creativity they inspire. Writers, filmmakers, musicians, and dreamers return again and again to the tunnels, layering new meanings on old stones. The catacombs have become a collective work of art, co-authored by centuries of priests, laborers, rebels, and wanderers. Their mythology grows not by decree of the city, but through whispers, stories, and images shared across generations. In this way, the catacombs are not a relic but a living text, endlessly rewritten by each visitor who descends with candle, camera, or courage. And so the catacombs endure as a reminder that life and death are not opposites but partners in a dance. The bones remind us of impermanence, and the banquets remind us of what to do with the time we have: to eat, to drink, to create, to love, to resist. Beneath the streets of Paris, where silence reigns and the weight of centuries presses down, people have always found a way to celebrate, to turn fear into ritual and ritual into joy. In the end, perhaps the catacombs' greatest lesson is not about death at all. It is about life, about the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to be cowed by the inevitable. The skulls on the walls remind us where we are headed, but the echoes of laughter, music, and clinking glasses remind us of what we can still do while we remain among the living. The catacombs are Paris inverted, its soul laid bare in stone and bone. They are a banquet that never ends, a gathering of the living and the dead, and a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, humanity will find a way to light a candle, pour a glass of wine, and carry on.